Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another IPDAY webinar Wednesday. I'm really excited about all of our webinars, but particularly really excited about our webinar today. Data for the People, a cross-functional examination of the role of MISATFOR. Today we have facilitating our webinar is Michael Johnston, the Vice President of Institutional Research and Management Information Systems at Pensacola State College. I want to really thank him so much for taking time to deliver this important webinar to all of us. But before we get started and before I turn it over to Mike, I just want to remind you of a few housekeeping issues. As you know, all IPDAY webinars are recorded and archived, and this will be posted on the IPDAY website. You are in listen-only mode, but we really want you to interject your thoughts and any concerns or questions or comments that you have. Please enter them into the Q&A option on your screen, and we will be monitoring that. And Mike will be looking at those questions throughout the webinar to answer them. So I know we have a lot to talk about, and data is on the mind of a lot of people, Mike. So thank you again so much for taking the time for us today. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Johnston. Mike.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I look forward to some great discussions, and I hope I can provide some insight as to what we do here at Pensacola State College, but also the relevance of the role of an organization that the Florida colleges participated in called MISATFOR, which allows us to leverage and communicate data structures across borders. So with our sister institutions, and even the relevance that's related towards the districts, because a lot of the same data fields and data elements are required for us to send. So I'm going to try to elaborate a little bit about what we do at MISATFOR, what I do at Pensacola State College, how we're able to communicate effectively, but then ultimately some of the tactics and the opportunities that we use to validate our data, because we know that it's changing and it's evolving, and often it's not always the easiest, especially with the multiple hats that so many of us have to wear at the same time. That often those that are involved with data and data structures and data reporting, because of the nature of what we do, allows us to be knowledgeable on so many different areas and functions of your organizations and institutions. So that's when you see different people that get asked to be involved in different projects, and that small category of our job description that says other duties as assigned keeps getting larger and larger. So the role of MISATFOR, and I feel so privileged because I get to work with a lot of organizations that really drive a lot of change across our institution. I love adult education. I think it's fantastic. I think it's more needed now than ever in my lifetime, in my history. And I love seeing the outcomes, and I love being able to measure them too, because that's the way that I think and the way that I work. I love quantitative analytics because it helps drive process change. It helps evolve opportunities for future investigations, and that's the big part to it. So in the state of Florida, we have 28 state colleges, and the colleges range in size. We have some very large ones, and then we also have some small ones, but specifically of the 28 colleges, 11 of them have adult education programs. So not every college in Florida offers adult education programs. There is a position, a role at each institution that is designated by the Florida Department of Education, where we have a reports coordinator. And the reports coordinator is in charge of working with all the different subject matter experts across the institution to ensure that the data is accurate and the data is reported in a timely fashion, and then also that what is being reported is understood by the subject matter experts. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit about on opportunities to make sure that we can confirm what we're wanting to send is what we actually wanted to send. Just because, and I warn reports coordinators all the time, just because you don't get any errors in your submission doesn't necessarily mean your data is correct. And I'm going to be very transparent. I'm going to tell you about experiences that I've had personally at organizations where we've discovered opportunities that have actually been very helpful. So MISATFOR works with dozens of different reports that are produced that are given that many individual subject matter experts on the different campuses are not actually aware of. And these reports are impressive because they are a common way that they are a common utility that is used in order for us to evaluate each other and also the data submitted on our behalf. So MISATFOR is an organization. It stands for a Management Information Systems Advisory Task Force. So it's a longer title, but what happens with this group is that we meet together twice a year, and we get together and we go through dozens and dozens, okay, hundreds of different data elements. And these data elements are reported and they're grouped into different categories, from student to personnel to admissions to our facilities. And we call those databases. And then within each database, they have all these different fields and record types. And lo and behold, all that sums up to be is that we're sending the Department of Education our data about our students, our data about our faculty, our data about our business and our processes and funds. So it gives us a really interesting perspective that allows us to communicate what is being done at our campuses specific towards our students and our outcomes. So just be very cognizant that I've often heard, oh, we've had a successful submission. We have no data that's airing out. But again, there's a difference between data that airs out and the data that does not have errors. So just being cognizant of that, I think that's important. When we submit data, there are different time periods that are specific towards adult education. And that is something that I try to impress upon the different institutions because of the necessity to make sure that those time periods where the state of Florida takes an extract of data that we submit and uses it for different purposes. So this is an example of a timeline, something that I think and work through on a semesterly basis in order to make sure that we are evaluating our data, that we're not missing anything, that there's no decision that was made in one department specific to a process that was not communicated with the research division, and we have somehow missed that in a calculation. So I'm continuously going through this and working with our team to collaborate and open up great lines of communication that are safe, such that people can openly discuss our data. So in a traditional semesterly process, in the fall semester, we're reporting our data from the summer that existed prior, and then also at the beginning of the fall semester. So in August, we're able to start sending our data in these big databases to the state of Florida, and we are able to we're able to see if the data is meeting the expectations of the state of Florida. We're making sure the data isn't error out. We're making sure that someone didn't accidentally type in their middle name having numbers and it should just be letters. All these different error situations, we call them edits, will be pointed out to us upon submitting our different data. So as we're submitting these different databases, our student database, our facilities database, our personnel database, they all have similarities and relevance to them. However, there's a key point there in September, as you can see that little bottom loop that's a beautiful color blue, that says that any data loaded towards adult education is going to be used for federal and state reporting. So I'm going to say that one more time. There is a small excerpt that exists in September such that the data that is submitted by the colleges is going to be used for NRS reporting. So even though the data is not due until the end of October, and you're allowed to resubmit and resubmit and resubmit the data to get it to the way you want it, that's locked in at the beginning of September. So that is why in the process of our data evaluation at Pensacola State, I prioritize adult education at the very beginning, because if we do not do so, then there could be options later on that could manifest into problems. If I wait until the very end, because we might change that data in October, there could be a calculation difference. We may realize that maybe some tests weren't entered in time. All these different situations could have occurred. But again, I can't impress upon enough that there are time freezes such that they exist outside the traditional and the traditional process of the date submission, like the September submission of adult education. So please, if you are working with your reports coordinator, whether you're at a district or a college, make sure you communicate and discuss this timeline. You can always reach out to me. I can show you exactly where it exists as well. So that way we can help and make sure that we all collaborate together. As soon as we submit that adult education data, they ask for a certification that comes directly from us, and that comes the week afterwards. So that's a certification form where we confirm what we're sending is correct. Then what happens is that there's these close dates for the rest of the data. And that's when we have to finish submitting our summer data, and then the beginning of our fall data. That happens in mid-October. And then we have FTE predictions, and I'm going to talk about something called FTE 1, 2, and 3, a way for all of the organizations to compare the FTE of your program to the other colleges that exists and is openly granted by the State Department of Education. So we'll talk about that one in a second. But a nice part about this is that work with your reports coordinator, because there are dozens of evaluation reports, such that once we submit the data to the state, they come back with these reports that are nicely color coded that can help you determine your outcomes of your data submission. So those are something that are produced on your behalf, so you don't have to bring in another research analyst or another data scientist. These are things that are going to be produced on behalf of each college and organization that submits their data. So keeping that in mind, it can help alleviate a lot of work, and those are tools that are prepared on our behalf for our benefit. So when we look at our different databases, we have lots of different types. Again, the major categories that we have are student, faculty, admissions, facilities. We have an integrated database, which is a little bit different. It's a combination of all the different databases, but for the important relevance of what we're discussing today, I want to emphasize the student database. The student, a little bit of facilities, and we'll talk a little bit about the personnel as well. The student database contains our WIOA data elements. And remember, these WIOA data elements must be collected every semester. We just went through an audit with the Auditor General's office, and that was a big question that they engaged with us about, was how do we confirm that the data that we're getting is obtained on a semesterly basis. So if one thing I can impress specific towards this topic is that make sure you find ways that the data is actually gained every semester by students that are returning, not necessarily new students because you won't have prior semester data, but how does your group obtain data that is relevant towards the semester that they're attending? Because that was an important topic of conversation that we had with our Auditor General. And then lastly, the databases must have these interactions. And if they don't interact, if they don't all mesh well together, you get total failure of the database submissions, and that just leads into further problems and opportunities. So let's talk about the student database and some of the student demographics that exist out there. These are really interesting because this allows us to send a whole slew of information about our student population, their successes, and how they're doing. In this situation, we have to send our class records, we send their dates of birth, we send their names, we send all this demographic information about them, but we also send their completer records if they've obtained any, we send their test results, we send their LCPs, we send everything about them that you could possibly think of that's collected. The state of Florida asks, and in this also is those important WIOA data elements. Remember that these student demographics are fluid, things change, and they need to be obtained semesterally. The homeless status of our student population is changing, the income level of our student population, our income status, whether they're working or not working, that needs to be obtained on a semesterly basis. One topic that is so important are the course records that are associated with the attendance hours specific to each student. Make sure you have a great understanding of how those hours should be calculated. I could spend a whole webinar talking, a whole hour talking about the attendance based on the students that are attending, and even more specifically, this was a big topic of conversation as well with our Auditor General, because they focused and dove into the attendance at the student level, confirming that not only did we submit the correct hours of attendance appropriately dictated based on the guidelines, but also making sure that we had proper ways of keeping the attendance sheets and rosters that are collected at the individual class level. So that was something that was extremely important for us. I spent a lot of time with the Auditor General's office, myself and my team members at our organization, to confirm that we had everything the way that they wanted it to be, and also making sure that we were doing it correctly as well. So testing records are submitted in this database. These tests needs to be consistent with the time frame of the semester. So be very careful about those time frames that the student took the test and then the semester of which you submit them. So dates and times are extremely important. whether you're offering, whether you're offering a whole slew of opportunities to take tests, make sure that those tests and test scores are dated appropriately, because that could not only be an edit issue when you submit your data, but also an audit issue. So being very cognizant of that, those are some important guidelines to think about when you're working through and working with your reports coordinator specific to student database. We'll dive into a couple more data elements that I think that are pretty impressive in a couple slides. So when we look through our faculty, our faculty database and our personnel, we have to submit the faculty and their courses that they teach. And this is really interesting because this is how the personnel database coexists with the student database. In order for a student to take a class, the class has to exist and be taught by someone. So that class and that faculty member have to be submitted in the personnel database. So when you are evaluating the databases to make sure that you have the correct information that is sent by your organization to the state of Florida, you want to make sure that the correct information is also existing in personnel. And here this talks about the level of education of your faculty member, the types of courses they're teaching, and so forth. So that's going to be submitted here, as well as the demographics of your faculty members, but that's not used in terms of referencing the success and outcomes of your students. That's used on other facets related to your institution, but not specifically on this. So next we have our facilities. So the big part about facilities is this is not very fluid. This is discussing and identifying where your students are taking their courses. Remember, in order for a course to exist, for a student to take, it has to have not only a faculty member assessed, which is then identified in the personnel database, then that's also identified in facilities, because the class has to have a room or even an online location. So this is where you submit the classrooms. So we submit everything from hallways to attics, to classes, to buildings, to sites. There's not one part of that institution that is not identified via the facility. So that's going to be something that's not as fluid, but you want to take a look at it to make sure it's correct. When I look at this and I evaluate the way that we work through our different database, that I sort of look at this as a tiered donut model, because I like to start off at the very bottom and make sure we got the facilities. It almost is a way for me to feel better about the success of going through and getting our facilities and making sure that we got them all correct, and the classrooms are correct, and the area of the classrooms are correct, and all the different parameters specific to them are correct. Not as important the subject matter area, but just making sure that we have that understood and it's not incorrect is a big success for me. Then I go through and look at the personnel associated with those classrooms. Who are the faculty that are teaching in these classrooms? And that's the way that the facilities and the personnel relate. So then I go through and I look at the personnel. I look at the focus, and if it's specific to something like those that have adult education programs, I would start diving in to make sure that all of the information specific towards adult education is correct. Even certifications that adult educators have is a separate ad hoc report that's requested mid-year. So even making sure that if they have some special ESOL certification, some certification that allows them to teach in a traditional non-college setting, that is asked and requested throughout the year by the Department of Education. Then I look at the student database. The student database is something that I identify because I dive into it, because it has metrics that are associated with success. It has all of the expected outcomes that we want to make sure that the NRS gets via the state of Florida. And if those are not in the student database, if I can't emphasize that enough, make sure to understand this database, make sure to work with your reports coordinator and the research analyst to say, what exactly are we sending on behalf of our students? Because you need to know that it's not just what you think it is, but you need to have it demonstrated to you such that it is exactly what you want. Lastly, there's something called an integrated database, which I don't worry about as much in this circumstance because it combines all the databases together. But on top of this, we have these validation reports. As something I said before, when you submit, when your institution organization submits these databases, they go ahead and send you dozens and dozens of validation reports to help confirm that the data is not anomalistically incorrect, meaning that it shows trends historically, so you can compare and rapidly see whenever there's deviations from norms. And that is a big part of data validation. People have asked me on many circumstances, Mike, how do you data validate? How do you find situations and errors in data? And realistically, the easiest way of doing so without having to know large scale mathematical models or using advanced softwares is just looking at data historically and looking at percentages and looking at quantities and seeing if there's changes. If you have 6,000 students in one semester, and then you have 2,000 students in the next semester, that's a large difference. Why did that difference occur? There's a lot of ways that we can data validate just by looking at validation reports to determining, hey, is there a big difference? Is this thing statistically relevant? Is this just a coincidence? Is this COVID? Or do we report something incorrectly and get a whole bunch of errors that have caused the data to error out? And that's where you want to work with your research analysts, your reports coordinators at your organizations to make sure that you're taking charge and ownership over this, because ultimately, whatever is sent by your reports coordinators, your data scientists to the different organizations, whether it be federal, state, or local, that is what's telling your story. And that's what I try to impress amongst my colleagues all the time, is that I love hearing the stories. I love going to our adult ed division. I love teaching there. I will go by and I'll do a guest lecture every once in a while. And I think it just makes me the happiest person in the world, because I see the impact of what your organizations are doing that is so different from the data that we send on a constant basis. But again, those stories that I experience when I'm physically present in adult ed, I want to make sure manifest themselves into the story the data provides. And that's the key to the successful outcomes of data submission. Looking at FTE reports, ladies and gentlemen, FTE reports are fantastic. This is something produced by the state of Florida. It's used in a way, in a manner, as a utility to help drive the ability for organizations, for institutions to project their FTE longitudinally over a period of multiple years. So the state of Florida will pose us with these reports. They will say, okay, Pensacola State College, Chipola, Eastern Florida, here are your FTE reports, full-time equivalents. And your FTE is calculated by using the clock hours attended by your students. So there's a mathematical ratio that allows us to quantify the FTE, full-time equivalents, based off your student population. But the nice part is that if you look at this report, the first row there is Eastern Florida State College. It shows their upper division FTE, their advanced and professional, which is column number 2, their post-secondary vocational, which is that column 3, all the way down to the total FTE. And then it compares the institution's FTEs broken down by categories. In these projections, it also shows historical FTE broken down by category by school, and then also shows the projected FTE using the mathematical model that the state of Florida's Department of Education has adopted in order to project what the FTE is for your organization broken down by those different categories. So this is a very powerful tool to compare yourselves not only to yourself, but also to all the other adult education programs that exist across the state of Florida. So I could feel pretty safe, even though I look at, for example, that first row there, Eastern Florida State College, with their FTE totaling 10,790, that their adult basic education program being at a value of 0 is probably because they don't have one. So it's highly doubtful that they have one at a value of 0 and keep it open. So I would be able to surely say that Eastern Florida State College probably does not have an adult education program. However, if we look at Daytona State College, their FTE for adult basic education is 353. And then they have a GED prep or an adult secondary school, which has an FTE of 66. So this will help identify just even your sister colleges, your sister organizations that have adult education programs. And then using these reports, you're able to see the trajectory of whether that FTE is expected to increase or decrease, and help open and drive lines of communication. And that's a unique and powerful tool that you can use. And this is produced on your behalf. There is quite a bit of math that's involved with it. But the nice part is that the state of Florida's Department of Education does this on behalf of our organization. So I highly recommend that you work through and make sure that you understand these reports. In these reports, the college has the ability to agree with the projections, or they have the ability to dispute those projections. I have no problem working with our different divisions, department heads, and saying, hey, I want to let you know that we are predicting that your FTE is going to be going up. Mathematically, we're seeing an increase in our adult basic education program. I'm predicting that it's going to be going up by 7% every year for the next 3 years. How do you feel about that? And then often I will get feedback saying, oh, Mike, our FTE is doing great. Our students are coming back. They're doing great. They're moving in such a powerful direction. We're setting up different locations. I agree that this is going to go up by 6.5%. I've also had situations where different individuals have told me, no, Mike, I hear you, but we're closing down a program. I don't think it's going to project the way it is. So even though your math says one thing, my instinct says something else. And this is when I have to take the opportunity to evaluate both simultaneously. So understand that the colleges are responsible for predicting these FTE values and making sure that the one specific towards your area, the adult basic education FTE value, is accurately reported and that you agree with those predictions as well. These are grouped based off of the enrollment by class. So that's how these values are quantified. So this is another fantastic report that is produced on your behalf that requires no outside intervention from your institution whatsoever, other than submitting your data. This is something called the FREQ. So it's an abbreviation for frequency. So I was having a webinar recently, and someone wrote to me and they're like FREQ, and they thought I said FREAK or FREEK. I don't know what they thought, but frequency is the name of the report, comp frequency. What this does, this takes and breaks down each field, each data element that is reported to the Department of Education on your behalf, and then it actually nicely color codes any type of anomalistic difference. So when there is something that is egregiously different, it helps drive your eyes towards seeing the difference in outcomes from year to year. And the nice part, this is longitudinally reported. You can see there that it shows difference from 2018-19, from 19-20, 2021, and so forth. And it allows you to see whether or not you expect changes from different areas specifically. So this is data element 2005, and this is going to be our program enrollment. So this is it's a very powerful opportunity. I'm sorry, this is program completion. I don't have them all memorized. So this just allows us to see, hey, this one's red. Why is this one red? Why are we expecting such a large difference? This one's green. It's going up in a different way, but it allows you to see these colors. Work with your reports coordinators and make sure that you get copies of their FREQ reports specific towards the student database, and then identify the data elements. And we'll talk about some of them that are specific to you, so you can evaluate and see what the state of Florida has on behalf of your different division. So FREQ is fantastic. It's part of the student database submission that occurs in the outcomes. So keeping that in mind, it's definitely something to review continuously. So here is where I get into more of a situation that is either completely accepted or some that do not like this at all. And I'm going to be very transparent. Errors exist. They exist all the time. It's just the nature of what happens. There is so much data that is reported on behalf of your organizations and your students that your system, your enterprise that holds the data doesn't always account for. That there's sometimes something that there's fields that are called proxy variables and calculated fields, and I'll talk about those in a second, that are derived because the state of Florida requires us, the feds require us to submit data. But it begs the question, what happens if you don't have it? Can we derive the data from other different data? So possibilities of errors can exist, and I recognize here that when you are working in an environment that is open and supportive of recognizing errors, where people are not in fear of their job or in fear of repercussion, then I think there's more opportunity for people to publicly acknowledge them, and then we can fix them. I have seen so many circumstances where I've seen people that are very worrisome of pointing out an error that was made and letting that error persist semester to semester. And often we will see that when errors persist in data submissions, once the data is locked and submitted, there's no way of changing it. So that data persists indefinitely, all when in fact it could have been changed if recognizing that there's an atmosphere that is accepting of errors exists without repercussion. So I always talk about gotcha situations. I can't tell you how often I see this, and I really don't like them. And especially occurs in group string emails where people want to point out other people's flaws and errors. And I never want gotcha situations. If I see something that's erroneous in an email, I try to go above and beyond to make sure I don't have to group acknowledge it. And I try to work with my team members to make sure they don't do it either. I don't play in a situation where I appreciate gotcha situations like, oh, here's why you're wrong. 2 + 3 really equals to 5. It's not 6. there's no reason to do that in a public venue. So I always try to encourage an environment where there's no gotcha situations, especially in public emails. So state of Florida is going big with performance-based funding and opportunities. So I like to point out situations that are extremely opportunistic for potential performance-based opportunities. So performance-based opportunities exist because when money is attached to performance, then often we see different movements. So I do see there was a question saying for the comp freak. I'm sorry I missed that question come in, Michelle Timpiero. If you could maybe elaborate, I'd be more than happy to answer that one. I wasn't sure exactly what you're referencing, but I can go back if you'd like me to go back, Ms. Timpiero. So again, we see performance-based funding exist in many situations. Why isn't ESOL? Okay, so why isn't ESOL? Okay, so FTE report, I got it. So I do have a question from Michelle Timpiero. Why isn't ESOL calculated? ESOL is calculated, the FTE, specific with adult basic education. So the adult basic education FTE here, let me go back to that slide. Where's that slide? Okay. So in the FTE reports, the adult basic education has your ESOL combined into that FTE value. So these are actually categorized based off of something called your course classification. It's called an ICS value. And the ESOL, oh yes, okay, got you, Michelle. Yes, so for the comp freak, that is also driven the same way, absolutely. So thank you so much for clarifying. So the comp freak doesn't break them down by ICS category, but you'll be able to see the ICS categories of each one of the courses associated. ESOL representation in the groups. Oh, I got you. Is ESOL represented in the groups? No, they do not disaggregate ESOL and the comp freak, no ma'am. But the nice part is that your institutional research department, your department that does do this, they can do that for you if that's something that you're interested in. And I'm going to show a couple of reports today, Ms. Timpiero, that actually demonstrate some of the ways that we evaluate our own internal data separate from the Department of Education. So those are great questions. So yeah, ESOL is a little bit different. You're very welcome. Yeah, I'm going to explain a little bit on that. ESOL is a little bit different, but they have not disaggregated it and separated it away from its sister counterparts. So except they have the GED prep courses those ones are separated because of the way the national classification occurs. So just keeping these here, performance-based opportunities, they exist everywhere. Enrollment, baseline performance opportunity. When enrollment goes up, that's going to usually drive options for performance-based funding. But again, it's not all about enrollment, that there's also benefits and opportunities for different areas of that enrollment. And the state of Florida over the summer held a performance-based funding group discussion put together of different members of the college system and the districts to discuss performance-based funding metrics potentially for adult education. And I was fortunate enough to be a part of it, but this is sort of what I was gathering from it that I like to share with people. Think about this. How do we measure gains with students that are in these programs? Any way you can measure types of excellence or accelerations is going to be a potential opportunity for performance-based funding. So we want to make sure we get those gains submitted. Post-completion success. Where are your students going after they finish your program? Are they going to a technical college? Are they going to a state college? Are they going to a university? Are they going directly into the workforce? What are your students post-completion success? What does it look like? And I'm going to show you a tool that we leverage at Pensacola State very heavily to identify where these students are going after we go. And this one is one of my favorite tools because I love seeing the impact of where our students are going and what they're doing. And it's a fantastic tool. And then at-risk category. So how do we identify students that are at risk? In a adult education, I've heard when I've said that before that they say all of them are at risk. And I can see that many are at risk. But if we could imagine tiers of risk categories, there's some that based off of the questions that we have to submit and the questions that we ask of our students upon application that could be considered more at risk than others. So often we use proxy variables or outcomes that are calculated based off of data that you have internally to determine at-risk categories. So we'll talk a little bit about those, but think about this as being potential performance-based opportunity areas such that when funding is associated with them, there are incentives for different outcomes. And we're seeing that all across the state of Florida. We see it nationally. We see it with the colleges. We see it with the universities. We see it in medicine and healthcare. We see it in just traditional sales. You know, people that hit different sales categories make more money. They just call it bonuses, and they call it hitting your marks. Here they call it performance-based opportunities. So this is an example of what I get to look at on a pretty consistent basis. This is a very important data element that is specific towards WIOA and adult education, and this is the AGE employment status field. So first thing that I like to talk about here is that notice that when we look at this, look at those table values. So what this says is that we have to submit for every student this data element outcome, data element 1052. Is the student an E, which is employed, which means the student is either A, they did any work in all that was paid, B, they did work in his or her own business, all the way down to D. Next thing you know, we have S, they're employed again, but they received a termination letter, or they are separating for some reason. So they were employed, but that is changing or transitioning. Then there's a U, which is unemployed, and then there's N, not in the labor force at all, and they're not seeking employment. This is a tough field to ask a person to answer. And we ask some complicated situations. We have to report these, but often we don't report it as in the same, we don't ask the question with the same level of detail that the definitions provide. So looking at this, be cognizant that the employment status of a student, if they're employed and they are earning money and they have their own business, or they are being compensated by a family member, that would be considered, in my opinion, someone that is less at risk than someone that's not employed or completely not in the labor force. So if a student was being targeted for an at-risk situation for performance-based funding, I would say that a student that's identified as SUNN, employed but in termination status, unemployed or not in the labor force, would be considered more at risk. But again, look at the complexity about these data elements that I'm showing you, because they are not necessarily the easiest things to understand. Single parent is another data element to report. This identifies whether the student is a single parent or a situation that I find a little awkward, but they ask about a single pregnant women. So that's that value B there. So that's a special group of, it's a really special group. Not only are they a single parent, but they have to be single parent and pregnant at the same time. And I know for many of our students, that's just a very awkward question to ask, but this is something that we have to report. Then we ask them if they're single and then they're pregnant by themselves, and that's a table value W. So if we look at this, that there could be situations where students that are some of these categories that are identified in this data element could be more at risk than others, but this is something we report on each one of our students twice a semester during the fall and the spring. So displaced homemaker, wow, look at that definition. Those definitions A, B, C, and D there on the right side, those are some pretty complex definitions. We have to think about, are we really answering these questions correctly based off of the information we're giving the student to disclose at the time they apply, or maybe do a reapplication, or they do a survey in order to get these answers? But the displaced homemaker is a very important question. Those that exist without compensation or remuneration are considered displaced homemakers. Any student that falls in these categories could theoretically be in that risk situation. These are other data elements that I think are potential opportunities to identify students that are considered at risk. So if you were to think and go back after this webinar and this discussion and say, gosh, there's so many data elements, where do we even start? These are some great ones to start with back to your organization, to work with your reports coordinator and say, I want to dive into these data elements. How are they identified? Where do you derive these from? Are these derived fields, or are these derived fields? Or is this something that comes directly from a survey that we give our student, or from an application? But we have the ex-offender status. Are they homeless and runaway? Are there any kind of employment barriers? And this one I think is a perception data element. Are they migrants or seasonal farm workers? What is the level of schooling that's completed? And this goes back all the way to first grade. What are their withdrawal reasons, which is specific towards a course. And then again, course entry and exit dates are important because this is something that was a highly affected field by the highly discussed field by the Auditor General. So course entry and exit dates, again, another field that's extremely important that we submit. Calculated fields. So I like to talk about calculated fields because it's not as bad as they come out to be. They are ways that data can be created from other data. So what I mean by that is that, let's say the student applies to the institution and I say that I have come in and I am Hispanic and I am white and I am of Asian descent. That we don't have a field on our application that says, are you multiracial? We say, are you African-American or Black? Are you Asian? Are you white? Are you any of these different disaggregated ethnicities or races? Well, ethnicity is only one, Hispanic, but are you any of these disaggregated races? From there, we might have to create a calculation to answer a question about multiracial. And that might not be something that the student actually discloses on their own, but we're going to have to come up with a calculation, a field that is determined based off of a programmer stating that if the student answered yes to more than one of these races or ethnicity, then report them as being a multiracial student. So calculated fields are formulae that are written by programmers that often don't have the same subject matter level of expertise as those that are running your departments. They're trying their best, but this is where you, as your subject matter expert, can really help drive the understanding to both those that are calculating these fields, that are developing these calculations and submitting this data, and then also making sure that you feel comfortable with the way that it's calculated. So here at the very bottom of the slide, I put together an example of a calculated field that we write, because when our departments, when they submit the student outcomes for their TABE scores, they actually put in that the student achieved on their TABE mathematics a 452. So Michael Johnston is a student. He achieved a 452 on his TABE 1112, and from there, that's all that is submitted, the test score. However, now we have to derive from that test score that LCP that's associated based off of that score itself. So we could see there that since the test score of 452 falls in that second row of 449 to 495, that means that the LCP awarded is going to be a value of B. So think about the opportunities there for erroneous errors, erroneous data, is that maybe someone might have mistyped a value and interpolated a value. Instead of being maybe a 300, maybe they typed a 200, or the max range was an interpolated value. Instead of typing a 595, they put a 575 to award that value of an LCP award D. So these are examples of situations where a missed keystroke can have a catastrophic and deleterious effect on the data outcomes that you submit on behalf of your institution. So logic is used to create these data elements. Make sure you understand that logic. Data is changing over time, and calculated fields often are not changing the exact same way because people forget that they exist. People forget they exist. I'll give a prime example. There was a situation where at Pensacola State College, we added more ethnicities, so students could choose more ethnicities to their on their application. That was not informed to the Office of Research. And the calculated field that used those ethnicity outcomes to determine a multiracial category was not updated because there was one decision made in one department that had a very systemic effect in our department because we didn't know that the options changed. So just because there is a decision that's made in one area can have a high impact and effect on those that are referencing that one data field that is not a calculated field, one that is obtained at the time the student applies to the organization. So one thing that I can't stress upon everyone enough is work with your reports coordinators. Make sure that you have a firm understanding of which one of your data fields is submitted as a calculation, which one of those fields is a calculation. Are they deriving the displaced homemaker field based off of other questions that are submitted and answered on your student's application? Are they deriving the student's Are they deriving the student's homeless status based off of other questions? Which one of the questions are derived fields? Which one of the data fields are derived based off of calculation? And which ones are just transplants, meaning that if the student says that they are male, that just goes right into the male field. So there's no calculation associated with it. If the student says that she is female, then they directly take that female outcome and put that as the female gender for the student. So work with your reports coordinators, whoever's submitting your data, and say, I need to know each one of the data elements that you're submitting that is specific towards my division. Which one of these are specific to my division? Give me a list. Okay, now of this list, tell me which one of these data fields are a calculated field, which one do you have to write a formula for in order to extract and then send on the behalf of our organization, and which one of these are transplants. Then once you have those calculated fields and those calculated field definitions, the formulae that are associated with each one, say, I want to see those formulae and review them with you. I want to make sure that I agree with this definition of how you're calculating and interpreting this data, so that way we can all be on the same page. And I take no offense when I have different deans and department heads and directors and teachers that want to know exactly how we determine these calculations, because they can be impressive. They can make huge movements. But again, programmers change. We have fluidity with our team members. Whether you stay at your current organization or go on to a new one, there's always going to be reporting that's associated with it. Make sure that whoever's doing that reporting is actually writing those calculated fields the way that you want them to be, because you are the subject matter expert that oversees your division. You want that story to be correct. So once we have those calculated fields, once we have these, if we have a report that doesn't exist, I love when people at my institution write to me and say, hey, Mike, I'm very informal. Hey, Mike, I need a report that breaks down our ESOL students. I want to know the ESOL by age, by semester, by campus. And I say, sure, no problem. Let's work on that for you. Ask questions to your research team for reports that have utility that you think could help drive change. And this is a fine balance, because often we get a lot of requests for reports, a lot of questions for data and analytics. And there's a fine line between what do we have to use to improve processes or improve the student experience, and what is just nice to have. So I often appreciate when different individuals that are requesting reports or analytics state, hey, Mike, I'm really curious because I'm seeing a drop in our ESOL FTE. Is there any way you could break down an ESOL, give me a report where you break down ESOL by campus, by time period? And I say, gosh, that makes perfect sense. I would love to get that report for you. That's very different than a question that says, hey, Mike, can you give me an ESOL report? It helps, not just because I really want to get into everyone's business, but if I have to prioritize every dean and every department head and every individual that's curious about something, it helps to know there's a reason as to why it's going to be used to improve a process. That way we can drive those measurements to collaborate and work together. So this is an example. I want to provide you some examples of some reports that we use here at Pensacola State College in order for us to help determine outcomes. LCPs is super important for adult education. I've redacted, this is an example, I've redacted student information, so you can't ever tell who it is. But this is an example of a report that gets sent out at a row level. So this is row level data. You can see there that first row is student 1. They have a name, they have a major code at PSC. They have an LCP point type. That's going to be that value of L. They have a point that they earn H. Their point subject is reading. They have the test date. That test date is so important. I want to see that test date. And this is a student level data report. So there is a lot, and I color coded it here. Okay, I did sort of, so we do not color code these reports. These go out as Excel reports. So we could see that row level reports are great because it allows us to dive into the student data. And this is one that we submit, and you can have a copy of what it looks like. Work with your research team and say, you know, hey, I just met this team at Pensacola, and they have this report to help identify student level data to make sure we're getting the right LCPs in. Can we develop one of these and work with them to make sure that they understand what you need? But sometimes when you're working in thousands of rows of data, it's tough to find anomalies. And that's where we can take this data and work with that research team and say, hey, you know what, I appreciate this. Can we have this in a form that allows me to drive some analytical perception? Could you put this into a chart? Could you put this into a form? So I took that same data that you saw in that picture before, and I converted it in Excel to a chart that allows you to see the breakdown of the LCP type awarded by semester, by group itself. So you can see there that on the CASAS listening, if you sum up all those LCPs awarded in that first row in 2019-3, the summer they were 12, Then the fall there was 19, the following semester in the spring there was 17, and then it dropped down to 7. So this allows you to see something a little bit differently because it's a lot easier to analyze and see where the numbers are changing either in a large circumstance or a small circumstance. Graph it. This is the same data, ladies and gentlemen. This is the same data that I put, but I put in a graphical form with some colors. Some people are much more visual. Work with your research team, your analytics team, your data scientists, and say, hey, could you help me put in a way that allows me to easily visualize this? This is a data science exposure right here. So I often say get rid of grand totals. So this value right here at the end, this distorts ranges when you put in grand totals, or remove those from your Excel. And I used Excel for this just because everyone has access to Excel and there's no extra cost associated with it. So some groups use SAS, some people use R, Python. Those are really good analytic softwares, but there's some costs associated with them. This was done in Excel. So as you can see, grand totals can often obscure data. So look what happens when I yank out those grand totals and I only look at the totals of the individual groupings. So here we can see that the costless listening is grouped together in a quantity, costless reading is grouped. Language, look, that's just low. What's going on with language? Pensacola, why is language low? Math is a little bit higher, and then reading is skyrocketed, but we can see in that yellow line that in 2020.3, without me doing any major analytics reviews, something went on with the reading that's showing that it's up pretty high, especially from the rest of the groups. What's going on? How come we're getting so many more reading LCPs? That's a question that you can ask, and that's how you can start diving into the data to really finding the etiology and the structure behind it. You could look at just grouping the LCPs by category, for example, which is what I do. So the costless listening here was grouped by their individual point awarded. You can see that there's been a little bit of fluctuation, however, trending pretty similarly. So nothing that's screaming to me at some point. I did throw the grand total, the costless listening there in that first column of data, as you can see, because the numbers are not distinctly large. Whenever you see differences in ranges that are in the double or triple digits, that'll help. That'll mute other peaks and troughs in your data. But again, work with the data, make sure that you are happy with being able to rapidly analyze differences in outcomes. Here's another example, and this is the total hours report, student total attendance report. You can use this, replicate as you want. This just shows student level data, the total hours that they've attended their sections, the total possible hours they could achieve, their first date attended, their last date attended. I stress this a lot because we work so much with our Auditor General's office. Again, a very powerful report to confirm the attendance that's being submitted on behalf of each one of your students for each one of the sections that attended is in fact exactly what it's supposed to be. However, sometimes it's nice just to do a quick summary chart of that same data, and you can see the total hours that exist by student. So again, a summary chart is something that's a very powerful analytical tool that can be done rapidly in Excel, and we could always do a session and discuss that as well. I love discussing what you can do with Excel because it's a very powerful tool that most people have access to. And this is something that I love to use specific towards being able to track students post-graduation or post-completion. What are the students doing after they finish their program? So this is actually my data. So I go ahead and just because I always want to show people the utility, the National Student Clearinghouse has a fantastic program called the Student Tracker that if you're not using now, work with your research department, work with your team members that do the analytics and say, hey, I want to see where our students are going. I just went this webinar. They have the Student Clearinghouse. This shows here your enrollment, my enrollment, based off of where I went to school with my dates. So this is nice because it shows where people are going before or after some time period. So you can see that I went to Indiana State College, then I went to the University of Miami. It breaks down the institution, whether it's a public or private school, whether it's 2 or 4 year. There are so many organizations that submit this data that are required to submit it. So the student tracker is a fantastic experience, but the nice part, you don't have to do it just by single student. You could do this by group of students. So this is an example of a report from our adult education program of student 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down. And you can see that we got some students that are traveling all over the place. We even have situations where we can demonstrate that students are going to get degrees and certificates that they are earning outcomes, which is fantastic. So use and leverage the Student Clearinghouse, the Student Tracker. It is a fantastic resource to determine post-completion efforts, or if the students haven't completed, did you give them enough utility so they could go somewhere else and start their barbering certificate? Did they go somewhere else and start to become welders? Those little opportunities to determine what's happening afterwards using this resource is a fantastic experience to determine utility post your program. So when I think of the foundation of successful data sharing and opportunities, the first thing that I recommend is internal reporting. Create visualizations that you can rapidly identify trends that are differentiating or changing in short periods of time. So if you are able to look at those internally using a software like Excel, if you have Tableau or Power BI, there's plenty of them out there. There's a lot of organizational softwares that exist that have a lot of utility and assistance that can be found directly on YouTube and MOOCs. I love those because we don't have a lot of resources to pay for extra money in continued education. So I leverage those very heavily. I recommend early validation as easy as possible. I know it's easier said than done, but work with your team members as early as possible. And lastly, create that culture that allows a transparent visibility to recognizing that it's okay to make errors. And if errors exist, I'd rather them be discussed. I've really enjoyed talking with you all. It is now approximately about 5 till. I'll be more than happy to take any questions. I've been trying to answer them as they come in, but it's been a pleasure, everyone. It was great to speak with you, and I really enjoyed this time.
Mike, thank you so much. Remember that this webinar is recorded, so you can come back and look at it or share it with your staff multiple times. At this point, there's going to be a feedback slide that's going to come up. If you could just take an opportunity to answer these 3 short questions, we would definitely love to hear your feedback. I want to remind you while you're doing this feedback that on December 8th, next Wednesday, our webinar will be GED program update. We're going to be talking about some new tools from GED and resources that will help to generate student success. So Mike, thank you. There's a lot of compliments coming through of excellent presentation. I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you.